Let's talk about F2. Okay. F2, F2. One is rising and the other is falling. Okay. F2 transition correlates with place of articulation. F1, irrespective of place of articulation, you had your cues. Okay. F2 correlates with place of articulation. So for stops, F2 varies with your vowel. Like for example, with D and do, there are two vowels. Your F2 is rising with D, but it's falling with do. So it changes based on the neighboring vowel. But can I sit here and tell you that for what vowels it's going to be rising or for what vowels it's going to be falling? No, it's not. It's difficult to attribute a particular direction for a particular place of articulation. Okay? It's very difficult for us to say what place of articulation is going to produce a rising or a falling transition. Okay, but the key thing to know here is F2 transition correlates with place of articulation. Okay, for stops, the F2 transition varies with your neighboring vowel. Okay, but one thing we can say is that the degree of raise and fall depends on the neighboring vowel. So for E, if it was going to be like for here, look at this, the degree of the form and transition is much more than the degree of form and transition for the do. The do's will be the same because of the first form and being at the same level. Okay? So let's just talk about form and transition for a second. Form and transition happens because when you finish releasing the sound, it has to move to a neighboring sound. The transition from the stop production to the neighboring sound is going to change the resonance in your vocal tract. Due to those changes in the resonance in vocal tract, you're going to see form and transitions. Okay. Now, form and transitions can be classified as F1 transition and F2 transition. F1 transition does not depend on the place of articulation. The key thing to remember in F1 transition is a CV or a VC combination. For a CV combination, F1 is always rising. For a VC combination, F1 is always falling. F1 meaning the transition. I'm talking about the transition here. Okay? And the transition is what you see like this. I'm sorry. Let's hang on. I'll correspond it to where it needs to be so you can actually see the image. Okay, there we go. So it's always rising right here, right? And it's always falling for the VC combination. Now F2 transition, it correlates with the place of articulation. It also varies depending on what the neighboring vowel is going to be, whether it's going to be a rising or a falling. But it's not easy to tell whether it's going to be a rising or falling. It's very difficult to attribute a particular direction for a particular place of articulation. So all you need to remember is that F2 transition correlates with place of articulation. So it can either be rising or falling, as in the example D and do. Okay? All right, so that's an example. If you observe, this is a CV combination, all F1 transition is rising, okay, and about F2, let's look at it. You cannot say whether it's rising or falling. For example, if you see, this is a perfect example here, is the first three vowel sounds are raising, and then the others are falling. So you really cannot tell whether it's going to be rising or falling, but it depends on two things, place of articulation and the neighboring vowel. So this is an important question. I'm going to ask you this in your midterm. I'm going to say the form and frequency transition, F2 transition, depends on what two factors? Place of articulation, neighboring vowel. Does F1 depend on the place of articulation? No. Irrespective of the place of articulation, F1 is always rising in a CV combination and always falling in a VC combination. List the two factors that form in transition 2 depends on. F2 transition for stops depends on two factors. One is the place of articulation and the other is the neighboring vowel. You need to remember this because that's definitely going to be there on your final exam and your midterm. The final acoustic cue that we're going to talk in stops is called the voice onset time, right? Now this voice onset time is a very important cue within stops to differentiate between voiced and voiceless sounds. Okay, so think about this. A voice onset time is a cue of stops, and within stops, in order to say whether it's a voiceless stop or a voiced stop, this voice onset time is an important cue. Where is this voice onset time? Just look at this graph for me here. If that's going to be my burst noise, that is when it's released, and if that is going to be my form and transition, this space between the release of my noise to the onset of phonation of the other vowel is going to be my voice onset time. So, voice onset time is the time between the release of the articulated vowel pitch or the beginning of the noise burst to the beginning of vocal fold vibration for the following vowel. Okay, so that's where the transition takes place. So the space between the release of the noise burst and the start of phonation for the neighboring sound, that space is called the voice onset time. Okay, so right here is my noise burst, right here is my release, and that sound is going to be my voice onset time. Same thing over here. And that space is going to be my voice onset time. Voice onset time is measured in milliseconds. Okay. For voiced sounds, the voice onset time is going to be shorter. Okay, and I'll come to that in just a second. Remember this. Voice onset time for voiced sounds, that is b, d, and g, is going to be shorter. But for p, t, and k, there is a delay of at least 50 milliseconds before the phonation begins after the release, so greater VOT. So, voice onset time is a cue to differentiate between voiced and voiceless sounds within the stops, okay? It is a time between the release of the noise burst and the onset of phonation of the neighboring sound. That time is called the voice onset time. Okay, it's measured in milliseconds. The voice onset time is shorter for voiced sounds and it's longer for voiceless sounds. Okay, it was defined, this time was defined by two authors, Lisker and Abramson. Again, as I said, the timing between the stop release and the initiation of phonation is called the voice onset time. It's usually measured in initial stops. It's an important point to know. Okay, so when I say bat or cat or tap or pat, the voice onset time is usually measured for those initial b, k, t, p. Okay, so that's the sound that is usually measured for initial stops. Now, let's think about this. Okay, I want you to really think about this voice onset time. Voice onset time can vary in duration. Okay, so for example, if I'm talking about b sound, I'm not even finishing the word, b versus p sound. Okay, now b is a voiced stop, right? So your vocal folds have to start adducting during the hold phase. So when you're thinking about, before even you release the b sound, your vocal folds have to start in order to produce the b, which is a voiced sound. And then a is a voiced sound. So the onset of phonation from the time of release of the noise burst to the production of the next vowel, there is already a voice bar to it because of the production of the voiced b. Hence, your voice onset time is going to be very short in duration. But for example, for the p sound, right, the vocal fold adduction is going to start pretty much after the release of the noise burst. okay? Because p is a voiceless sound. So your vocal folds are not beginning to adduct until almost the whole phase is over, and then only when the whole phase is over and there is a release of the noise burst, then your vocal folds adduct to produce the ah, which is a voice sound. Hence, your voice onset time, meaning the time between the release of the burst and the onset of phonation for ah, is going to be greater. I hope you get this concept. Just listen to me one more time. The voice onset time is a cue that differentiates between a voiced sound and a voiceless stop. It's only for stop. It's a cue. That is again an important thing. Is a cue. Voice onset time is a cue only for stops. Okay, in addition to the voice bar. All right, now, when you are producing the voice onset time, it can vary in duration. Think about just the sounds b and p. It's measured in milliseconds, right? For the production of b, during the whole phase, your vocal folds have to come together because b is a voiced sound. So the time between the release of the noise burst and the starting of a, which is a voice, there's already voicing component during the producing of the b, hence your voice onset time is going to be very short in duration. For p, the vocal fold adduction does not start until after your whole phase is over and you release the sound. Then your voicing starts to produce ah. So the vocal fold adduction takes a greater time, so your voice onset time is longer. That cue is what helps us differentiate between b and p, right? Just think about this. B and p, they have the same place of articulation. The only difference is from going from a p to b is the voicing of your vocal folds. Agreed? So even for perception, your voice onset time becomes a very important cue for perception of a voiced and a voiceless sound. So the longer the voice onset time, it is perceived as a voiceless sound. Think about this. The longer the time onset from the production or from the release of the noise burst to the onset of phonation of the next sound, which is a voice sound, there's going to be longer voice onset time. So longer the voice onset time, it gets perceived as a voiceless stop. Okay, so I have to say this, and I usually mention this as part of when I'm teaching in class, is one of our professors, Dr. E, who'll be teaching, if you come into the graduate program, he'll be teaching your neuroanatomy class, and he'll actually be teaching your speech science section 2. He'll be talking about, in your spring semester, he'll be your professor. When he did this experiment as part of his dissertation, he varied the voice onset time he had stimuli, synthetic stimuli, and he just varied the voice onset time from negative 0 milliseconds. Actually from 0, so his bar went from 0 to 60, and then the voice onset time, so if you go 0, then 10, 20, 30, 40. So you see how the voice onset time varied, right? When he varied the voice onset time, and he was asking people to tell them what sound they perceived. So he had people hooked up with electrodes. They had electrodes on the hand. They had a button. So it will go p, 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 b, p, 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 b, p. And when they did that, when they heard a different sound, p versus b, they had to press a button when there was a difference in the stimuli. So it will go p, 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 b. And then when you hear the b, you press the button. So the brain is registering that they heard a different sound. So in my language, my native language, I don't have the difference. I have a p, but I don't have a b. Everything is pa. It's written in the script also, even for b, is written as pa. So when we did that, when I was part of his, when he was testing his stimuli, I was a subject, and I could not hear the difference. I could not hear the difference between p and b with the voice onset time. That's because I don't have that in my language. The perception was very different. So I would go p, 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 b, p, p, and I would sit. I really had to pay attention to see the longer the duration it happened, then probably I could. And usually the difference that you can perceive between a voiced and a voiceless. So this is a voiced and this is a voiceless. around 25 milliseconds, a transition happens between voice to voiceless. So greater than 25 milliseconds of voice onset time, you start hearing as a voiceless. And I almost had to get to the 50 to 60 to be able to perceive that it was a voiceless sound. Okay, why am I saying this? It's helpful for you to understand this. The voiceless stop has to have a longer VOT to be perceived as voiceless. So voiceless has a VOT with a long lag, is delayed, and that's 25 to 100 milliseconds. So if I give you the graph that I have drawn here, and I ask you to say where does the transition happen from voice to voiceless, you have to say at 25 milliseconds, because voice onset time for voice stops can be negative to a positive 20 milliseconds. Why is it negative? In some sounds like Spanish or French, the voicing starts much before even production of those b, t, g, and d sound. Okay, so what did we see so far? We talked about the voice onset time, and we talked about how voice onset time is the time between the transition from the release of your noise burst to the onset of phonation of the following vowel. That time is called the voice onset time. It's an important cue to differentiate between a voiced and a voiceless stop. It's only a cue for stops. Okay, what are the things that you need to know? It's measured in milliseconds. Okay, a shorter VOT for voiced sounds and a longer VOT for voiceless sounds. All right. Okay. The final thing that we're going to talk about in stops is something called aspiration. Aspiration is also a cue for voiced versus voiceless stop. You see aspiration for voiceless stop and no aspiration for voiced stops. So what if I asked you within stops, what are two cues to differentiate voiced versus voiceless stops? You will say VOT and aspiration. The voice bar, of course, can always be, but these are the important thing for a stop, VOT and aspiration. Aspiration is a period of voicelessness after stop release. So if I go pin, that extra air that comes after I've released the p, before I say the e, that period of voicelessness is called aspiration. Okay, p. It's associated only with p, t, and k. Okay, it's an open glottis at the moment of stop release. It allows the breath stream to flow freely into the upper vocal tract without generating phonation. Meaning, before I produce the e sound, which is when my glottis has to close to start vibration, even the duration following the noise burst, there's going to be an added release of breath stream into your vocal tract, and that added release results in what is called aspiration. Okay, how is aspiration seen? Aspiration is seen like an extra spike. So let's go back here. Okay, there we go. Okay, that added release is going to be your aspiration, which you don't see in the voiced sounds. Okay, so two cues that differentiate between voiced and voiceless is going to be your VOT, voice onset time, and it's going to be your aspiration. Aspiration is a characteristic of voiceless sounds. It's a period of voicelessness right after the stop release. So if you say pen, pin, tap, and you produce the sound, and see there is an extra bit of air before you say the vowel sound, and that is called aspiration. Okay, all right. The final thing that we're going to talk today is another manner of articulation. So before I do that, I'm going to sum stops. Let's sum stops. Stops are non-resonant and non-continuous sounds. They're very transient. Stops can be voiced or voiceless. How are stops produced? You have the hold phase or the closure phase. Before that hold or closure phase, your velopharyngeal port has to close and you have to completely occlude your vocal tract. The characteristic or distinguishing feature of stops is the momentary cessation of airflow. That's the hold phase. It corresponds to the hold phase. Once the hold phase, there is a lot of build of intraoral pressure. Then there is a release phase when this pressure gets released as an audible burst of noise. Okay, so how are the cues associated with it? The first acoustic cue is a silent gap. In the silent gap, there's nothing that you see on the spectrogram for a voiceless sound, but you will see a voicing bar for the voiced sound. A noise burst is an audible burst of energy, which you can see as a vertical spike, which is 10 to 35 milliseconds in duration. And this vertical spike is more prominent for voiceless sound than voiced sound. Once the noise burst is released, and because of the transition that happens to the neighboring sound, you see another cue, which is because of the sudden change in the resonances of the vocal tract, and that's called the Forman transition. We're concerned about F1 transition and F2 transition. F1 transition is always rising for a CV combination and always falling for a VC combination, and it is irrespective of the place of articulation. However, F2 depends on the place of articulation and the neighboring vowel. Those are two factors which changes the direction of the F2, the neighboring vowel and the place of articulation. Okay, but it's very difficult to pinpoint a certain direction, change of direction for a certain kind of articulation. But you do need to remember that F2 transition direction, whether it's a rise or a fall, depends on two factors, which is the place of articulation and the neighboring vowel. The final cue that we talked about was voice onset time. Voice onset time helps us differentiate between voiced and voiceless consonants, stop consonants, only cue of stop consonants. It is a time that is measured from the release of the burst to the onset of phonation of the neighboring vowel. Voice onset time for voiced sounds is going to be shorter in duration, okay, and it's going to be longer in duration for voiceless sounds. All right. And the two cues that differentiates between voiced and voiceless is going to be an aspiration and the voice onset time. All right. The final manner of articulation we're going to talk in terms of this lecture is going to be affricates. Affricates, there are only two affricates in English, the ch and the j, like in chair and jar. Okay, this is the voiceless and this is the voiced. A stop plus a fricative. So what happens during this? There is a stop, and there is a stop, right? There is a complete occlusion, stop closure of your vocal tract, and the release is a fricative release. So it's a stop closure plus a fricative release that results in what is called the affricates. Okay, so you have a stop closure, you have a burst noise, extended duration of aperiodic sound, which is the frication, and then it looks similar to fricative on spectrogram, but it's shorter in duration. So if you look at it, very similar to what a fricative would look like, and here is the voicing bar for the j sound, but it's very short in duration. In frication, you saw how the width was more than what you see for the fricative. Sorry. Okay? All right. Affricate is very simple. Only two affricates. Affricates look very similar to fricatives on the spectrogram, but they're shorter in duration in terms of that high frequency energy that you see. And it's a stop closure plus a fricative release that results in an affricate. So if I asked you, affricate is a combination of what two types of manner of articulation, then you have to say stops and fricatives. That's it. That sums are stop consonant. It sums are acoustics of consonants. So we talked about nasals, we talked about fricatives, we talked about stops, and we talked about your affricates.